Now, how many of you have ever heard of Montesquieu? How many of you could spell his name? One of you. How many, if asked, as I asked some 14-year-old Japanese school children in the northern city of Hokkaido to name me Montesquieu's greatest theory? And all of them gave me his greatest theory. How many of you could tell me what Montesquieu contributed to our world in terms of theoretical? Any of you? One, maybe two. I'm sure you're modest. There are a few more of you. But basically, he's disappeared. And he illustrates very well the point I made last time, which is that our world has been shaped by people like Montesquieu, but they've disappeared because probably he's had more effect, theoretically, on our modern world than almost any thinker in history. As you'll discover, it was his work that was the foundation for America. The American Constitution, Declaration of Liberty, all the rest of it comes from Montesquieu's work. And it was his work that was the basis for the French Revolution. It was his ideas of equality and liberty that fed into the philosophy of the French Revolution. So the two great revolutions that founded our modern world, in many ways, come from Montesquieu, yet we know nothing about him. So although he's the driest and the most distant of the people I'll be talking about, and I hope from then on it'll come a bit closer to your worlds, I hope I'll be able to persuade you that he's worth having a look at. I've also mentioned that lectures aren't a very good way of presenting information, so what I've done is, in the handout that's coming out, I've given you the plan of this lecture, so you don't have to take many notes. You can just annotate points, so you'll see the whole plan and points I want to make. And for those of you who want to follow up Montesquieu, you can either read the book, in which I try and describe his work. There are 3 chapters on Montesquieu in the riddle of the modern world. Or you can go to my website, www.alanmacfarlane.com, and download those chapters as PDFs if you've got Acrobat. The idea of doing that was that I put it up especially for your ancestors, so to speak, the people who did this option last year, this paper last year, and they found it very helpful. Not everyone wants to know more about Montesquieu or Adam Smith or any of the people I talk about, but some of you will, and that's a short way, because you may not be able to get the book, but you can have a look at what I wrote about him. Why start with Montesquieu? Well, probably because he is the start. He is the start of sociology, anthropology, economics, all the social sciences. And this is not just my view. Evans Pritchard, who I hope you can now spell now, Evans-Pritchard, Pritchard, in his History of Anthropological Thought, starts with Montesquieu, and he says, if one has to begin with somewhere, or rather with someone, it must be with Montesquieu. I agree with Professors Aron, A-R-O-N, and Durkheim, who I hope you can spell now, and Durkheim, that it is he who should be called not a precursor of sociological thought, but its modern founder. So, you may recall the paradigm shifts that I talked about in my last lecture. This is the first paradigm shift, and I'm going to take 2 people from the Enlightenment, Montesquieu and Adam Smith, as examples of this. What began to happen is that through changes, which I suggested last time, were political changes in relations between Europe and the rest of the world, the growing power of Western technologies, the growing power of technologies such as printing, clocks, gunpowder, ships and exploration, and the development of science. The balance began to shift, and Western thinkers began to view the rest of the world and try and understand it and put new patterns on it. The lecture I give now will only just touch on the surface of Montesquieu, who's a complicated thinker, and you can pursue it if you want to. I'm going to be particularly concentrating on his methodology, because I think his methodology more or less foreshadows almost everything in the social sciences, and it therefore may be useful and interesting for you. If you are interested and wanted to read something of Montesquieu's, then his Persian Letters, it's a novel about someone who, a Persian dictator or gentleman who visits Europe and comments. It's a kind of reverse anthropology. It's someone looking from the outside, from Islam, at Europe, written in the 1720s, published in 1721, Lettres Persanes. It's a very readable book, a delightful book, and I'll quote from it at the end, show you a little bit about it. It's difficult to know what else to read, because his great book, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, is a great book, but it's almost unreadable. There are various reasons for this. One is that he decided that he would try and make it unreadable. It's something which you may have noticed with a lot of anthropologists. They make their work unreadable, partly to keep people's interest in it. And he explicitly says this. He says, you know, if you write a very simple, clear book, it will be the fashion of the day in Paris salons, and then in a few weeks it'll be gone. If you write something complicated, if you leave out the middle bits of arguments, for example, so people have to jump across. So he spent a lot of time complicating his work. And also the order of the book is very confused. It hops from place to place. So you can read bits and enjoy them enormously. But as a whole, it's very difficult. And that's why I wrestled with him and tried to simplify it and synthesize out loud. I think if you are interested, if you read some of my introduction or one or two of the introductions which are on the reading list, then you'll get very confused, I should think. It's a scrapbook, really. It's his pensée, it's his thoughts over his life put into this extraordinary book. Now, looking at, I'm not going to proceed following the plan that you've got in front of you, except I'm going to just change it round a little bit and start with in 1689. In very, very briefly, these are the main events in his life. He published his Lettres Persanes in 1721. He travelled around Europe, including 2 years in England between 1728 and 31. And he published his Considerations on the Decline of the Romans, which is a great book, in 1734. And the next year he started his Spirit of the Laws, L'Esprit des Lois, which was published 13 years later, and he died at the age of 66 in 1755. You may not really believe that he ever existed, and this is part of the reason for putting up pictures of where he existed, because it's very difficult with these long-gone ancestors to actually feel their presence at all. So this is where he did all his writing. He was a nobleman. He worked in the Château de la Brède near Bordeaux. That's where he lived, in this nice moated castle, which I hope one day to visit, and I hope some of you, if you're in that area, will go and visit on my behalf. This was his library. Elegant library with the books along with that. This was a time when you could have almost all the books that had ever been published in a library that size. Imagine the day. Wonderful. So he had almost everything that's ever been written, by the Romans, by modern people, in that library. Interestingly, though, although he sat no doubt at a table and scribbled down notes from all these books, when he was composing his great works, he left this library and he had a little hole in the wall of this big castle. He used to sit in there. It was almost just a tiny slit of light. It was like a prison cell. And he did what many thinkers do, which is excluded the world and excluded the data and just thought and wrote. And synthesized out of all this data, and I'll come back to that in relation to his methodology. Unlike some of the later people whose handwriting I'll show you, he had quite decent handwriting. He's summarizing here, my French is not very good, but cet ouvrage est le fruit de something de toute ma vie, of the work of all my life. This is the fruit of the work of all my life, the Spirit of the Laws. As for what he looked like, unfortunately it's just before the time when very realistic portraits were made. Adam Smith is a bit more realistic, but not much. But once you get to Tocqueville, you get really good pictures. So this is really a Roman senator disguised as, or the other way around, disguised as Montesquieu. The pictures are all rather idealized like this. There's probably some resemblance, but I'll leave it up because in previous years people have said it's rather nice to have the person I'm talking about staring down at you, so here he is. Now, I want to move on to what kind of guy he was, the contradictions in his personality and experience. The world was changing around him, and he himself was a torn and agonized individual. All the people I write about, and perhaps all of us, are torn and agonized, but it's more evident in these great figures. He was an aristocrat, as I've mentioned, very wealthy, yet he was also loved. He would dress up as a peasant and wander around his estate and go and have supper with his tenants and so on. So occasionally visitors were rather startled to come and meet him, this peasant, and say, you know, where is the Count of Montesquieu? And he'd say, it's me. He was an aristocrat, and that meant in France that you didn't dabble in merchant things, in things of the hands, the dirty, polluting commerce of the world. Yet he was near Bordeaux, his family were involved in commerce, and he was quite interested in money, and he didn't think it was somehow a thing an aristocrat shouldn't do. He was both cosmopolitan French. He spent a lot of time in the salons and clubs of Paris, but he was also spoken a Gascon accent and was very proud of his regional roots. He was a Catholic, but he also was married to a Protestant wife and was closely connected to the Protestant communities in that part of France. He loved France and admired its civilization, but he almost equally loved England and admired its civilization, so he was torn between those two. He lived, as I say, in a changing world where he he's just on the edge of a new civilization. As you know, the world was one kind of world until about 1750, roughly, and then you begin to get the world we live in, an industrial, scientific, capitalist world. And he was living just on the edge of this. And it was particularly apparent to him, partly because he lived near a great trading port, Bordeaux, and you'll find the same thing with Adam Smith living near Glasgow. Everything, the whole world is very close. The sea communications meant that he was much closer to many parts of the world than someone living inland, and also to the wine trade and to trading. This led to his, I think, helped him in the width of his vision. He says somewhere, or he's been described as trying to encompass the entire history of all the men who have ever lived. He is the first great thinker who encompasses all history and all societies in his work. Another event that enormously influenced him was that he lived on the intersection between a time of absolutism. Louis XIV, who was in power for a very, very long time, between 1643 and 1715, died when Montesquieu was 26. So he lived in the last days of an absolute despot, more or less, a man who was above the law and who was a great imperialist, Louis XIV. But when Louis XIV died, the whole of France gasped with relief. I've recently been to China, as I may mention more than once, and the feeling that you have in China now that the shadow of Chairman Mao is receding must be the sort of feeling that they had in France when Louis XIV cleared off. So he lived on the last shadows of the ancien regime, an absolute dictatorship in a new world. He also lived in a world where the power balance between Europe and its nearest rival, which was the Islamic civilizations, was shifting. Until 1650, 1700, there was no doubt that the Islamic civilizations of the world were much more powerful militarily, theoretically, in every way than Europe. Europe was a beleaguered backwater. But from the middle of the 17th century, the power of Islam, for one reason or other, remained constant perhaps, and the West began to get more powerful. And his Persian letters really are a reflection partly on that change. He also was affected by the emergence of Britain. In his early youth, Britain had gone through the Glorious Revolution in 1688, the contractual kind of monarchy that was established, the philosophy of John Locke, which was based on the contractual theory of power. And so when he read about Britain and when he visited England, he felt a great sense of shock. He was still living in an ancien regime absolutist state, and yet he visited a prosperous, free, as he put it, country. He spent 2 years in Britain, and when he arrived, he said, "I'm here in a country which hardly resembles the rest of Europe." It's as if you're visiting China or Japan, but there's only the channel between. It hardly resembles the rest of Europe. And he described it in a sentence which has enormous implications for sociology as progressing the furthest of all peoples of the world in 3 important things: in piety, in religious sentiment, in commerce, in wealth, and in freedom, in political liberty. And those are ideas which are later taken up, as I'll show you, by Max Weber. The relation between Protestantism and capitalism and so on are foreshadowed in that phrase. Yet he still lived under the shadow of that old world, the continuing power of the Catholic Inquisition. He would wake up in the middle of the night sweating in terror that the Inquisitors had come to get him. The Inquisitors were still there in Paris. They could suddenly swoop, they could take you off, they could kidnap you, they could take you off to Spain or Italy and declare you a heretic and, if necessary, burn you. And to show that this was a real fear, all his books had to be published out of France. The French censors wouldn't allow the Spirit of the Laws, the Persian Letters, all these had to be published in Holland because they couldn't be published in France. He lived also, as he felt, in a time of a movement within Europe, a shift of power. Until about the end of the 17th century, the great powers of Europe had been the Mediterranean powers, Spain, Italy, France, and so on. But just at that point, suddenly, it began to feel as if the power balance had moved forth to Scandinavian countries, to Holland, to England, to northern France. And he reflects, a lot of his work is trying to work out why that happened. Another great shift was in the scientific revolution, the sudden apparent breakthrough, just in the first half of his life, in our deep understanding of the laws of nature. Reliable knowledge suddenly seemed to be flooding in, and a new kind of attitude seemed to be spreading. Another important influence was that suddenly the information about the world increased in volume greatly. This is the time of the explorations, of the penetration of Europe into many parts of the world, and in particular the new and rapid mass of information that was coming in about the Far East. The great works on China and Japan, Kaempfer, that's K-A-E-M-P-F-E-R, his great 3-volume work on Japanese civilization, and Ricauld, in his great summary of the Jesuit explorations of China, were both in his library, and he used both sources. And there was also new information on tribal civilizations, for example, Lapitau's work, I spelled it here, on the American Indians. So suddenly you could do an anthropology of the world. Montaigne, 2 centuries before, had tried to do something similar, and the wonderful writer, I think, do that, but he had much more limited access to information. Now, with all this information and these new inspirations, how was one to approach the question of writing a world history, which is what he tried to do? So I'll now turn to his theoretical methodology. The first thing you have to think about very deeply is what causes things. And he wrote an essay on causation for his private edification. It wasn't published. And a lot of his work is speculating. This is obviously very important for all of us to think about. A lot of his work is speculating on the philosophical problem of the relationship between necessity and chance. Now, all of us know that these are two ends. Things have to happen, determinism, teleology, moving towards things, and things happen by random chance. By the way, I forgot when I mentioned the word teleology. Last time I handed out some vocabularies of how anthropologists speak, so if anyone hasn't got that, I'm not sure teleology is there, but a lot of the words I'm using and others are using on that, so let me know. Anyway, he thought about this balance, and he comes, I won't go into it, but he comes to a very, very sane conclusion, which is that both are true. He gives examples of how what's known to historians as the Cleopatras Knows thesis, which is that if Cleopatra had had another different shaped nose, i.e., large and bulbous, and put off Antony and the rest of them, history would have been different. There wouldn't have been the wars, etc., etc., etc. So, tiny things, a heart attack in Saddam Hussein or whatever, and the world is a different place. So tiny things can have, and at times he takes that view. Just it's a complete chance. It's random chances. Small things have ripple-on effects, chaos theory, etc. Of course, he doesn't use the word chaos theory. On the other hand, he also believes that there are deep underlying laws in history which determine. And so in a famous passage, for instance, he says that if Luther hadn't existed, someone else would have said the same thing. Luther was just a force of history. So, and many of these laws are the ones that we should look at. They're laws of geography, climate, sociology, and so on. What is so interesting about him is that he has a very multi-level theory of causation. He's often thought, and some of you might have said that he would be someone who was just reduced everything to geography. That's often thought about him. But in fact, he says, the spirit of a people's laws, I quote, must have relations to the physical characteristics of a country, okay, geography, to the climate, okay, climate, to the nature of the land, agriculture, its situation, its extent, to the people's mode of life. They must have relations to the degrees of liberty that the Constitution can admit of, to the religion of the inhabitants, their inclinations, their wealth, their numbers, their commerce, their morals, their manners. Finally, have relations one to another, to their origin, to the aims of the legislator. And he says, I shall examine all these relations. Together they form what I have called the spirit of the laws. So he's a holist in the anthropological sense. Everything is important. Religion, culture, morals, law, climate, geography, everything. You can't leave any of it out. And it works in complex ways. As for his ideas of time, progress, and development, I mentioned to you that the great central thesis of the Enlightenment is that we've moved from a circular world to one where things progress. There is enlightenment. We move from darkness to light, and we move forwards. He's such a complicated writer that several of the leading experts on Montesquieu, I think, have misunderstood his ideas on this, like Judith Sklar, who's on the reading list. Half the writers on Montesquieu says he was still trapped in the old circular thesis. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, there is no progress, there is no... But the major writer on his life and work, Shackleton, quite rightly, I think, says that actually he does have an idea of secular progress. Okay, it's faltering, you go back, there's dangers on the way, but he does have a sense of progression and movement forward. And I think he therefore does foreshadow the rest of the Enlightenment thinkers who have this more strongly. Another way in which he's interesting is that he is a comparativist. As you know, anthropology basically is about comparison. And he compares all the time. Every remark he makes is comparative. He's comparing within Europe, between southern, northern, France, England, America, and so on, or between civilizations. A lot of his work is about China, a certain amount about Japan, or tribal societies. He's always saying this in comparison to that, and he takes a very broad sweep in trying to answer his problems. He is also, in some ways, the founder of the theory of ideal types. Now, I'm sure most of you know that what an ideal type is. It doesn't mean ideal in the sense of moral ideal or something you should aim towards. It means a simplified model of reality that, as used by Max Weber and by Montesquieu, that basically in order to understand and do comparative work you have to simplify things and try and get at their essence and then compare them to other situations. And he develops this and explicitly talks about it. But I think the thing that perhaps is most striking about him, and maybe most interesting to you, is that he is the first great structuralist. Now, structuralism, as you know, in the French sense, means not social structure in the British sense, but it means the relations between things. You have A and B, and what one is interested in is the relation between A and B. And this is structuralism. It's like, it comes partly from semiotics, as you know, and de Saussure. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is the sign. And structuralism is about relations. The word relation is absolutely crucial to all structuralist thinking. Now, this is exactly what was the central heart of his work. I was just going to find, he starts a tradition, which is why he's so interesting to later French thinkers, which goes through him, gets embedded in all French thought, and then comes up through Durkheim, Mauss, de Saussure, and Lévi-Strauss. They're all in the tradition of Montesquieu. He says that you won't understand the world if you look at things, particular things. It's the relations between things. It's relations between power and wealth and belief, or politics, or economics and religion. You can't look at religion without the relationship with these other things. In fact, there's an indication of this in various ways. Firstly, he was known as Monsieur Shows, because every sentence he spoke had the word chose, which means thing in French. Couldn't you speak a sentence without using chose, because he was talking about things and relations between things. And the other clue is, if you look at the spirit of the laws, the first sentence and the whole first page is about relations. Justice is a true relation existing between two things. That's the first sentence. A relation that is always the same, whoever contemplates it, whether it be God or an angel or lastly man himself. Justice does not lie in things but in relation to things. A lot of people haven't understood what he's talking about and get confused by that first page. But anyone who knows anything about structuralism can see that he's trying to set up a structural model. And this is what gives his work its power. But he is also a social structuralist in the British Fortesian, that's now Fortist type sense, because even a functionalist. He anticipates a lot of that. He says that you have to look at the whole, the parts, the relation between the parts, social structures as a whole. Another question which is raised in relation to his methodology is the balance between induction and deduction. Induction is working up from facts. I find it very difficult to remember these, but I've gradually managed to implant in my mind. It means you start with a fact. It's the crude Baconian, Francis Bacon's method. Let's gather the facts and see what they tell us about the world. Positivism, as it's sometimes known. Deduction is, let's start with the theories and then have a look to see what facts there are. And this is always a great tension in all social sciences, as you know. And he's accused of being both. At times he's accused of being too near the facts, too near climate, too near geography. He did experiments on sheep's tongues to work out, or at least he drew attention to experiments on sheep's tongues to work out something to do with climate and heat, and then worked up from that to the whole of Western civilization, working up from small facts. Other people said that he was the opposite, that he thought his ideas first and then picked his facts to suit his ideas. I think he more inclines to the latter than the former, but he also is very interested in data, and he begins to anticipate the real method, which is developed by Adam Smith and Tocqueville, which is that you have to do both. All research lies in having some theory. You can't start without a theory, obviously, but very soon you should start complicating that theory and checking it, and then the facts suggest new theories, and you work back and forward. It's known as the hypothetico-deductive method, or hypothetico-inductive method. You start with hypotheses, then you induce, then you go back and forth. And I think he does do that quite a lot. And he generates conflicts between his models and his data, which is the last point there. Now, what does he find out? I'll just make a start on this and then give you a little break. The first, his central question is, why is the world becoming free? Why, or how could it be made more free? How could we escape from tyranny and absolutism? His first premise is that it's a very difficult thing to do. Liberty is very, very fragile. He had the same view, and he's interesting to compare to Ernest Gellner, who's what comes right at the end, The Conditions of Liberty. If you're interested in an essay, which I'm going to suggest some of my students, that's quite an interesting comparison between his views of liberty and Ernest Gellner's views of liberty. Liberty is unusual. Most societies have never had it at the personal level, but sometimes it occurs. But it can easily be destroyed. A lot of his writing bears very directly on what's happening in the world at the moment, and particularly in America, the way in which the Americans dismantle their whole system of checks and balances and liberty and freedom of the individual as a result of one bomb attack, one plane attack, is an example of what he was talking about. You know, it just is snuffed out just like that, no problem. So liberty is very fragile unless you have checks and balances of certain kinds. There is a tendency, not a law, but a tendency to the abuse of power. Many of you know the famous remark, the most famous remark of Lord Acton. All of you know Lord Acton's remark? All power tends to corrupt. It's important to have the word tends to corrupt. But and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this was his view, that power tends to corrupt, and there is a law in history that as countries become richer, more settled, prosperous, technologies improve, you will get more corruption, you'll get more power, and it'll lead towards absolutism. There are exceptions though, and these are very interesting and puzzling. The ways in which this happens, he goes into. One very, very strong pressure is war. All you need is a war, and that's the end of liberty, basically. This happens because, as we've seen in the last few months, you suddenly have a war, whether it's on terrorism or whatever it is, and you can't allow liberties. You start curtailing them, you throw people into prison, you take away habeas corpus, etc. Another way in which it happens is that it then justifies raising taxes, dragooning your population. And he'd seen this in Louis XIV's activities, he'd seen it throughout history, he'd seen it in his great survey of Roman civilization, that the constant warfare of Rome had undermined its liberties, it corrupted its central government, and it led to an impoverished civilization. And that's one of the biggest threats there is. But his feeling, and some of you may or may not agree, but see what he says, was that there was a difference, that although liberty was partially extinguished throughout France and other countries, there was a difference between Europe at his time, which had some liberties, Holland, England, Scandinavia, bits of France, Italy and Spain, and Asia, in which the citizen was completely subsumed. I mean, Asia is a broad category, but he goes into it in more detail, where on the whole the citizen is melded into the state and there's no separation between them. So why was there this difference? And I'll just give you a break before I tell you the answer. Okay? Very quickly. Are there any questions of fact that I can... Yes? Gellner? Ernest Gellner, The Conditions of Liberty. If you look at the last lecture, you'll see his name there. He was, Ernest Gellner is the last one on the bottom right there. He was the professor of anthropology before Marin's return here. One of the last Enlightenment philosopher, maybe. He's the one who I will impersonate in the last lecture. I thought about impersonating Montesquieu this time, but I thought I'd better start off in a sober way with you. I might try and impersonate one or two of the other people. It'd be interesting to see whether it's better for me to talk about them at second hand or try and talk as if I was one of these characters. So maybe I'll try that with Tocqueville, who I particularly admire. Okay, so if you're gathered strength and recovered from concentrating, and I've done the same, we'll move on to some of his other theories. The reasons for the difference of the degree of liberty, he partly laid to these very large tendencies and laws. And this is, although it's very unfashionable, it's very fascinating in many ways. For instance, he argued that mountainous areas, I'll just give you samples of it in passing, mountainous areas tend to be freer. Switzerland is an example. They have various advantages. First of all, it's not really worth trying to crush and destroy them. And the people I worked with in the Himalayas in Nepal were mountain pastoral people, and they were very free and equal people in many ways, whereas the people down in the settled valleys, you can see this even in parts of England, the areas of dissent and Quakerism and freedom are areas, are rather poor areas, like the Cambridgeshire Fens, where Oliver Cromwell came from, or northwest of England. The lush, open, rich parts of countries and Europe tend to generate large wealth which accumulates at the top, and you get absolutist governments. This is his argument. Another geographical determinant is islandhood. And I'll come back to this later. Basically, even better than mountains as barriers to predation from the rich is a water margin, so to speak, a water boundary. Islands were the natural home of liberty, he thought. Now, anyone can think of counter-examples, no doubt, but his argument is related to this idea of predation and warfare. Basically, I think one of his central arguments is that land-based countries, nations, are trapped inevitably in the fact that they have about borders. Either they're going to be overrun and destroyed, and their liberties destroyed by, in particular, his bête noire, the Mongols, who just swept across and destroyed much of Islamic civilization, India, China, etc., etc. Either someone's going to invade you, or if you're going to repel them, you have to raise the taxes, you have to raise armies, and that always leads to the loss of liberty. The great advantage of England, for instance, was that it had a wide enough sea border, not too wide, but wide enough, so that it put its defences into the Navy. And the Navy, as was picked up by several Enlightenment thinkers, hardly ever do you get a coup led by naval men. I mean, when they're notoriously unable to walk on land, and they'd hobble around because they're used to going like this all the time. So basically, the Navy doesn't come in and take over the citadel, whereas the army very often does. So military coups, extra expenditure and so on are forced on societies, and they will be caught either in outward predation and attacking others to defend themselves, or being overwhelmed. And an interesting reflection, Tocqueville picked this up in relation to America, which I'll come up to later, but it's an interesting reflection that in a way what has happened to America is that it's lost its islandhood, that its freedoms were secure as long as it basically could treat itself as inviolable as an island, as Tocqueville says, but with September the 11th it suddenly became part of the world and the continents and has reacted as a result. He thought that this islandhood largely explained the difference between France and England, because in France you got the endless wars of attempted conquest by Louis XIV and others, a Machiavellian law that you have to get your punch in first before they attack you, preemptive strikes, etc., etc. And he said this leads to a great paradox, because the richest countries in the world have the most miserable peasantries, We are poor, he says, with the riches and commerce of the whole world. And soon by thus augmenting our troops we shall all be soldiers and be reduced to the very same situation as the Tartars. War, higher taxes, absolutism. So that's the part of the background. Another was religion, differentiating civilizations. He sort of believed that Christianity was an antidote to despotism because it opposes the state to a certain extent. But he was well enough aware of the power of the Inquisition to see that it's not just as simple as that. What he's really talking about in relations is that if there's a conflict between the state and the church, that will lead to liberty. If they're joined together, if you get what's known as Caesaropapism, that is, the Caesar and the Pope are the same, then this will crush individual liberties. And he thought that China was an extreme example, that its Confucian mixture of Confucianism, which isn't of course a religion, but an ethical system which supported and dovetailed in with the political system, meant that there was no room for separateness. Whereas in the West there had historically been a tension. Christianity grew up in opposition to the state, and something of that had remained and blossomed, particularly in Protestantism. The Protestant sects and the development of the Protestant sects gave a kind of breathing area for political liberties. He also thought that it had something to do with climate. You can take it in a simple form, which is basically the kind of view that my public school, which is one of those rough northern public schools which sent you running up and down the hills and jumping into cold baths early in the morning, they took the view that, rough, tough life and you become a free individual and all that, I suppose. That's the simpler, whereas people who live in sort of hot climates are feeble and lascivious and all the rest of it. That's the parody of his views. But in fact, he did have a great respect for the northern Europeans, and he thought that there must be something about the climate. Putting it again in a slightly different way, he thought that it was odd that nearly all the free areas were on the edges, were in rather inhospitable, backwardish areas. He gave as examples Tyre, Venice, and the cities of Holland. They're all founded on sort of muddy marshes. Why should they all be so famous for their liberty and prosperity to a certain extent? Goodness of the land establishes subjection and dependence, he said. So there's something to do with climate and geography. He also argued that this link between religion also links up to commerce and liberty. He's the beginning of a very widespread view, which was famously echoed in the work of John Maynard Keynes. Later, he said, Keynes is only reflecting what Adam Smith said in more or less the same words and others, which is that men are never so peacefully engaged, or words to that effect, as when they are making money. Churchill said jaw rather than war, and Keynes said make money and then people will stop fighting each other. And this is a view that comes up in the Enlightenment, that commerce, trade, interdependence between countries, China joining the World Economic Community and so on, diminishes the conflict between nations. And this is a view that he took, that the growing spread of affluence, consumerism and trade has a civilizing effect. One of his most interesting theories is again to do with where he usually sets a chain of causation, not a direct causal, this if this then that. And a very good example is in relation to agriculture, the effects of agricultural systems. He basically said that there are three great agricultural systems in the world. There's the northern pastoral systems, people who herd animals. They tend to be very free and equal. Then there are settled agriculturalists who grow grain and particularly wine, i.e. the southern half of Europe mainly. And here you begin to get power hierarchies building up and inequalities gaining hold. And then there are the wet rice civilizations of Asia in particular. And he argues that that kind of hydraulic, it's not the hydraulic civilization thesis, which is that basically you need very tough governments to maintain the water supplies in these societies. It's more that wet rice is a very efficient technology which leads to huge numbers of people, very intensive, large, dense populations who live at subsistence level, and just a tiny bit is creamed off to some very, very rich and powerful people at the top. So you get an increasing divergence in the social structure between a few very powerful people and a mass of impoverished peasantries in rice cultivating societies. And he relates it to the demography and so on, and anticipates to a certain extent Clifford Geertz's theory of agricultural involution, the idea that in such rice civilizations you can put more and more labor in and still begin to get returns, whereas in hard grain civilizations you can't get that. So here you have a mass of very hard working but very poor and illiterate people, with a few rich and literate people at the top. Finally, there's the effects of the size and diversity of political systems. This has been resurrected a number of times. There are lots of discussions by people like John Hall and all sorts of world theorists now wonder about what's sometimes known as the European miracle. Why did in Western Europe at a certain time you get the development of a certain kind of industrial capitalist civilization? And a lot of people think it's to do with the political geography of Europe. The point that Montesquieu anticipates all this, what he basically argues is that liberty will flourish when you get oppositions. The relations are not congealing together, so to speak. What you get is, in somewhere like China, is a huge, great civilization, but it's more or less homogeneous. There's very little differentiation. I mean, obviously language, culture, and so on and so on. But it's all ruled from the and if someone down here has a good idea or opposes someone up there, they get crushed. The idea either spreads very quickly or they're crushed. The political geography of Europe is very odd because, in terms of China anyway, it's filled with tiny little countries. Italy, what is Italy? What is Holland? What is England? You know, just a few million people, the size of an average Chinese city. And yet they're all like this. And when you survey the history of European civilizations, what you find is that this political geography, where they're all fighting each other, is not only a good Darwinian selective mechanism because you have a survival of the fittest and the power moves around, but also safeguards liberty. I mean, he was a case in point. His books were published in Holland. If there hadn't been Holland, he wouldn't have been able to publish his books. The printing press, which was discovered in Germany, was banned in Germany, but went up to England. The mechanical loom, which was developed in Holland and France, was banned in those places, but was taken up in England. So ideas and people and institutions and liberties are safeguarded by that, which is where what takes him to England. I'm sorry I haven't got time to go into this in detail, but if you are interested in what I've said so far, England is his prototype, ideal type case of how liberty can be protected and ensured. The last of the 3 chapters I wrote is about the English case. Basically, he argued that England, because it's an island, because of its middle-class nature, because of its never having been conquered, or at least since the conquest, because it has the development of a large civil society, lots of delegated power, and lots of what he calls intermediary bodies. That's his famous theory. But basically you have parliaments, town councils, universities, churches, sects. Lots of these civil society blossomed and flourished in England, and this gave the citizen protection against the state. It was the one country where this had happened. I'll be coming back to that theory because it's picked up later by Maitland in my other series of lectures on property and corporation, so I can expand it. And his final point is that how had this happened? Why was England different? And he takes what is a very unfashionable, but I think basically correct view, which is that it's because, in a funny way, it was a kind of secluded area which maintained, and this is a theme of Tocqueville and all the rest of them, basically the rebirth and re-sweeping of Roman civilization across Europe from the later Middle Ages destroyed the liberties of much of Europe. And England remained a kind of little backwater which preserved these elder liberties which had been current throughout Europe. And that might have been the end of it. They might have been squashed. But by an accident, and this is Tocqueville's view, by an accident it's transferred to America and then spreads around the world. So there's a story of, he's again parodied as someone who believes that the whole of modern civilization went back to the Germanic forests and the early settlers there. He does say that, sort of, but it's not quite as simple as that. Anyway, thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to seeing some of you on Friday.